My daughter-in-law, Vivienne, arrived at my doorstep in Millbrook Heights with a chocolate cake that looked too perfect, smiling too wide, and saying all the right words about how special this one was just for me. But when she insisted I try it immediately, right there on my front porch, something in her eyes made my stomach turn cold. So instead, I called my golden retriever Duchess over and fed her the first slice. Within minutes, Duchess was whimpering and retching in my garden. 20 minutes later, Vivienne's world started crumbling faster than her poisoned cake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in our quiet neighborhood. I was tending to my roses when I heard the familiar click of heels on my cobblestone walkway. Vivienne approached with that practiced smile she'd perfected over the 3 years since she married my son Timothy. She wore her usual pristine white blouse and navy skirt, looking every inch the devoted daughter-in-law she pretended to be. "Good morning, Eleanor," she sang out, her voice dripping with honey. "I have such a wonderful surprise for you today." I straightened up from my rose bushes, wiping soil from my hands with the old gardening towel I kept tucked in my apron pocket. Something about her tone immediately put me on edge. In all our years of strained politeness, Vivienne had never once brought me a surprise that wasn't calculated. She lifted a pristine white bakery box, the kind from Grandview Bakery downtown, and opened it with a flourish. Inside sat the most beautiful chocolate cake I'd ever seen. 3 layers of rich, dark chocolate with buttercream frosting, swirled in perfect rosettes around the edges. It looked like something from a magazine cover. "I made this especially for you," she continued, her smile never wavering. "I remembered you mentioning how much you loved chocolate cake at Timothy's birthday last month." I hadn't mentioned any such thing. In fact, I distinctly remembered declining the chocolate dessert that night, explaining that rich chocolate gave me headaches. But I kept my expression neutral, years of dealing with Vivienne having taught me to mask my thoughts carefully. "How thoughtful of you, dear," I replied, accepting the box. "I'll save it for after lunch." "Oh, but I insist you try just a small piece now," she pressed, her eyes brightening with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I'm so anxious to know if you like it. I used a very special recipe I've been working on for weeks." There was something about the way she emphasized special that sent warning bells clanging in my mind. The same bells that had saved me during my 40 years as a high school principal, the ones that could detect trouble from across a crowded hallway. "I really should wait until after I've eaten something substantial," I deflected, but Vivienne wasn't having it. She reached into her oversized designer purse and pulled out 2 plastic forks, already unwrapped and ready. "Just one tiny bite, Eleanor, please. I've been up since dawn perfecting this for you." The pleading in her voice might have seemed genuine to anyone else, but I caught the subtle edge underneath. This wasn't a request anymore. It was barely concealed insistence. My hands tightened around the bakery box as I studied her face more carefully. That's when I noticed the small details that weren't right, the way her left eye twitched slightly when she smiled, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands as she held out the forks, the fact that she'd positioned herself between me and my front door, blocking my easiest retreat path. Most telling of all was Duchess, my usually social golden retriever, who had retreated to the far corner of the porch and was watching Vivienne with obvious wariness. Duchess loved everyone, especially people who brought food, but she was keeping her distance, her ears slightly flattened against her head. "You know what?" I said slowly, setting the box down on my porch table. "Let me call Duchess over. She's been such a good girl this morning. Maybe she deserves a little treat first." Vivienne's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "Oh, I don't think chocolate is good for dogs, Eleanor." "Just a tiny piece won't hurt her," I replied, my voice steady and pleasant. "She's a big dog, and she's had chocolate before." That last part was a lie. I'd never given Duchess chocolate in her life. But I needed to see Vivienne's reaction, and what I saw confirmed every instinct screaming in my head. Panic flashed across her features before she could hide it. Real, genuine panic. "Duchess, come here, sweetheart," I called, and my faithful companion trotted over despite her earlier wariness. I broke off a small piece of the cake with one of Vivienne's plastic forks, noting how my daughter-in-law had gone completely still, her breathing shallow and quick. The cake was moist and looked delicious, with layers of chocolate ganache between each tier. Duchess accepted the piece readily, her tail wagging as she chewed. For a moment, nothing happened, and I began to wonder if my suspicions were just the paranoid imaginings of a woman who'd never liked her son's wife. Then Duchess whimpered. It started as a small sound, almost like confusion. She licked her lips repeatedly, then began pawing at her mouth. Within 30 seconds, she was retching violently into my prize-winning petunias. I looked up at Vivienne, whose face had gone completely white. She was backing toward the porch steps, her designer purse clutched against her chest like a shield. "I should go," she stammered. "I just remembered I have an appointment." But I was already moving, my 72-year-old body energized by a fury I hadn't felt in decades. "Stay right where you are, Vivienne." My voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades dealing with troublemakers, and it stopped her in her tracks. Behind me, I could hear Duchess's retching growing more violent, and my heart broke even as my resolve hardened. "What exactly did you put in this special cake?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. And that's when I saw it in her eyes. Not remorse, not shame, but disappointment. She was disappointed that her plan hadn't worked. 20 minutes later, as I sat in my veterinarian's office holding Duchess while Dr. Peterson worked to save her life, my phone began ringing. Timothy first, then Vivienne's sister Camille, then her mother Patricia from across town in Rosewood Gardens. Word was spreading fast through our interconnected families, but not the version Vivienne wanted them to hear. Because I had beaten her to the punch. While she was fleeing my porch in panic, I was already making my own calls, telling my own version of the truth. And unlike her carefully crafted lies, my story had something hers never would: evidence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 30 minutes after Duchess stopped vomiting and the emergency vet confirmed she would survive, I made 3 phone calls that would detonate Vivienne's carefully constructed world. 1 hour later, Detective Ray Morrison was standing in my kitchen, photographing the remaining cake with evidence markers. And by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Timothy was pounding on my door with tears in his eyes and questions I'd been waiting 3 years to answer. The first call I made was to my lawyer, Harold Westfield, who'd handled my late husband's estate and had become something of a family friend over the years. Harold was the kind of man who didn't panic easily. 40 years of practicing law in Millbrook Heights had seasoned him well. But when I explained what had happened with the cake and Duchess, his usually calm voice sharpened with concern. "Eleanor, you need to preserve that cake immediately," he said. "Don't let anyone else touch it. Don't refrigerate it. And for God's sake, don't throw it away. This could be attempted murder." The words hit me like ice water. Attempted murder. Of course, that's exactly what it was. But hearing it spoken aloud by someone whose job it was to know these things made my hands shake as I carefully moved the remaining cake to a high shelf in my pantry, far from where anyone could accidentally disturb it. My second call was to the police. The dispatcher who answered seemed skeptical at first. Poisoned cake probably wasn't the most common emergency call they received. But when I mentioned that my dog had already shown symptoms and was currently being treated at the emergency vet clinic, her tone became all business. "Ma'am, we're sending someone over right away. Please don't touch anything that might be evidence, and don't allow anyone else into your home until our officer arrives." The third call was the one I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I dialed Timothy's number at his office downtown, knowing he'd be in the middle of his Tuesday afternoon meetings at the architectural firm where he worked. My son answered on the second ring, his voice distracted and professional. "Timothy Ashworth speaking." "Timothy, it's your mother. I need you to come to the house immediately." Something in my tone must have cut through his work fog, because his voice changed instantly. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, but we need to talk about Vivienne. And Timothy?" I paused, letting the weight of what I was about to say settle in my own mind first. "You might want to bring a lawyer." The silence that followed stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Timothy's voice came back, smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard it since he was a child. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Your wife tried to poison me today. The police are on their way." Another silence, this one filled with the kind of disbelief that comes when someone's entire world suddenly stops making sense. That's impossible. Mom, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should sit down and— "Timothy James Ashworth," I interrupted, using his full name the way I had when he was 7 years old and had been caught breaking windows with his baseball. "Duchess is at the emergency vet right now because I fed her a piece of the special cake your wife brought me this morning. The cake Vivienne insisted I eat immediately, right there on the porch. The cake that made my dog violently ill within minutes." This time, the silence was different. I could almost hear the gears turning in my son's mind. The same analytical brain that had made him such a successful architect, now working to process information that didn't fit with anything he thought he knew about his wife. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said finally, and the line went dead. Detective Morrison arrived first, a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady presence that suggested he'd seen enough in his career to take everything seriously. He listened to my account without interruption, taking notes in a small leather notebook and occasionally asking for clarification on timing or specific details. When I showed him the cake still sitting in its pristine bakery box on my kitchen counter, he photographed it from multiple angles, before carefully transferring it to an evidence container he'd brought from his car. "Mrs. Ashworth, I have to ask, is there any reason your daughter-in-law might want to harm you? Any ongoing disputes or conflicts?" I almost laughed at the understatement of the question. "Detective Morrison, my daughter-in-law has been trying to push me out of my son's life since the day they met. But until today, I thought she was just possessive and manipulative. I never imagined she'd resort to this." He nodded, making another note. "We'll need to get this analyzed, which could take a few days. In the meantime, I'd recommend you stay alert, and maybe consider having someone stay with you." That's when I heard Timothy's car in the driveway, the familiar sound of his hybrid engine, and the way he always took the speed bump at the end of my street just a little too fast. Through my front window, I watched my son climb out of his silver sedan, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his tie askew. He looked like a man who'd run out of a meeting so quickly he'd forgotten to grab his jacket. But what struck me most was his face. Gone was the polite, controlled expression he'd worn around me for the past 3 years, the careful mask he'd adopted after marrying Vivienne. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. Genuine fear and confusion, the look of someone whose foundation had just shifted beneath his feet. Detective Morrison excused himself to make some calls from his patrol car, giving Timothy and me space for what we both knew would be a conversation that would change everything between us. As I watched my son walk up the path where his wife had stood just hours earlier with her poisoned gift, I realized that the next 60 minutes would either destroy what was left of our relationship or finally give us a chance to rebuild it on honest ground. The time bomb Vivienne had inadvertently set with her special cake was about to explode in ways she'd never imagined. And for the first time in 3 years, I was ready for the fallout. Timothy stood on my front porch for a full 30 seconds before knocking, and I could see him through the decorative glass panels beside my door, running his hands through his hair and pacing like a caged animal. When he finally raised his fist to knock, I was already turning the deadbolt. The sound made him jump backward, his face pale and drawn, in a way that reminded me of the little boy who used to have nightmares and crawl into my bed seeking comfort. But this wasn't a nightmare he could wake up from. I opened the door slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. Timothy's usually immaculate appearance was completely disheveled. His charcoal suit jacket was wrinkled. His silk tie hung loose around his neck, and there were coffee stains on his white dress shirt that suggested he'd abandoned his afternoon meetings in a panic. His dark eyes, so much like his father's, were wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "Mom," he breathed, and I heard 3 years of distance and careful politeness crack in that single word. I stepped aside without speaking, gesturing for him to enter. He moved past me into the foyer with the uncertain gait of someone walking on unstable ground, his gaze immediately finding Detective Morrison through the kitchen doorway. The detective was still photographing evidence, the flash of his camera casting stark shadows across my normally warm and welcoming home. The sight of the police officer seemed to drain what little color remained from Timothy's face. He turned to me with eyes that pleaded for this to be some kind of misunderstanding, some terrible mistake that could be explained away with reasonable words and logical thinking. "Tell me what happened," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me exactly what happened, and please, Mom, tell me you're wrong about Vivienne." I studied my son's face, seeing not the successful 31-year-old architect who designed million-dollar homes for Millbrook Heights elite, but the earnest boy who used to build elaborate structures with his blocks on this very living room floor. The boy who would look at me with complete trust when the world didn't make sense and expect me to fix whatever was broken. But some things couldn't be fixed with a mother's kiss and a Band-Aid. "Sit down, Timothy," I said gently, guiding him to the burgundy leather armchair that had been his father's favorite spot. He sank into it like a man much older than his years, his architect's hands that could draft perfect blueprints and construct intricate models, trembling as they gripped the armrests. I took my place on the matching sofa across from him, the coffee table between us scattered with Detective Morrison's business cards and evidence bags. The normal Tuesday afternoon light filtered through my lace curtains, creating patterns on the hardwood floor that I'd admired thousands of times before. But today, everything familiar felt foreign, transformed by the gravity of what we were discussing. "Your wife arrived here at approximately 11:15 this morning," I began, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "She brought what she called a special chocolate cake from Grandview Bakery. She insisted I try it immediately, right there on the porch, and became agitated when I suggested waiting until after lunch." Timothy's jaw clenched. "That doesn't mean she was trying to poison you, Mom. Maybe she was just excited for you to taste it." "Let me finish," I continued, holding up my hand. "When I called Duchess over and gave her a small piece instead, Vivienne panicked. Real panic, Timothy, not surprise or concern for the dog. She tried to leave immediately, before we could even see if Duchess would have a reaction." I watched my son's face as he processed this information, saw the moment when his rational mind began connecting dots he desperately didn't want to connect. His hands moved to his temples, fingers pressing against his skull as if he could massage away the truth. "Duchess started retching within 2 minutes," I pressed on, my voice gaining strength from his obvious distress. "Violent retching that required emergency veterinary care. Dr. Peterson said if she'd eaten a larger piece, or if she'd been a smaller dog, we might have lost her. But that could be explained by..." Timothy started, then stopped himself. Even he couldn't finish that sentence with conviction. "By what?" I asked softly. "By coincidence? By Duchess suddenly developing an intolerance to chocolate she's never had before? By Vivienne's strange behavior being completely unrelated to my dog's immediate illness?" Detective Morrison chose that moment to join us in the living room, his evidence kit packed and his expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Ashworth, I presume? I'm Detective Morrison with Millbrook Heights Police. I'll need to ask you some questions about your wife's whereabouts and activities over the past few days." Timothy looked between the detective and me, and I saw the exact moment when the reality of the situation hit him fully. This wasn't just family drama or misunderstanding. This was a criminal investigation, His wife was a suspect in an attempted murder case. I don't understand, he said, his voice cracking. Vivienne loves my mother. She's always talking about how she wants to have a closer relationship with her. She brings her gifts, remembers her birthday, includes her in family events. Detective Morrison and I exchanged a look. Mr. Ashworth, the detective said carefully, in your observation, has your wife ever expressed any negative feelings about your mother? Any complaints or concerns? Timothy was quiet for so long, I wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low we had to lean forward to catch his words. She says Mom doesn't like her, he admitted. She says Mom is cold and unwelcoming, that she makes Vivienne feel like an outsider. But I always thought that was just, normal mother-in-law, daughter-in-law adjustment issues. Has she ever suggested that your relationship with your mother interferes with your marriage? Detective Morrison continued. Another long pause. Timothy's hands had stopped trembling and were now clenched into fists on the armrests of his father's chair. She says I'm too attached. That a man my age shouldn't still be so close to his mother. She thinks it's unhealthy. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Timothy, how long has she been saying these things? He looked up at me, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. Since the beginning, Mom. Since the very beginning. But I thought if I just gave her time, if I showed her that she was my priority now, that you both could learn to get along. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Detective Morrison made notes in his little book while Timothy stared at his hands, probably replaying 3 years of conversations and conflicts through a new lens. Mr. Ashworth, Detective Morrison said finally, I'm going to need you to think very carefully about this next question. Has your wife ever asked you about your mother's health, her medications, her dietary restrictions or allergies? Timothy's head snapped up. Last week, he said immediately. She asked if Mom had any food allergies because she wanted to cook something special for her. I told her Mom had mentioned that rich chocolate sometimes gave her headaches, but that was all I could think of. The detective and I looked at each other again. If Vivienne had been planning to poison me with chocolate, knowing that I avoided it due to headaches, would have made it seem like the perfect cover. I'd eat it to be polite, get sick, and everyone would assume it was just my usual reaction to chocolate. Except she hadn't counted on my instincts, or on Duchess. Timothy was staring at me now with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of horror, guilt, and dawning understanding. Mom, he whispered, what have I done? The front door slammed with such force that my grandmother's china cabinet rattled against the wall. Vivienne's voice cut through the house like a blade, high-pitched and desperate, calling Timothy's name before she'd even crossed the threshold. I heard her heels clicking rapidly across my hardwood floors, moving with the frantic energy of someone who knew their carefully constructed world was collapsing. Timothy, where are you? Her voice grew closer, more panicked. Your secretary said you left work in a rush. What's going on? Why won't you answer your phone? Detective Morrison stood up from his chair, his hand instinctively moving toward his badge. Timothy remained frozen in his father's armchair, staring at me with that expression of dawning horror still etched across his features. The three of us waited in my living room like actors positioned for the final scene of a play none of us had wanted to be in. Vivienne appeared in the doorway, and I had to suppress a gasp at her appearance. Gone was the composed woman who had stood on my porch 4 hours earlier with her perfect smile and pristine outfit. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was disheveled, with several strands escaped from what had probably started as an elegant chignon. Her white blouse was wrinkled and had a coffee stain across the front, and her navy skirt was twisted slightly, as if she'd been moving too quickly to notice. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were wild, darting between Timothy and me, with the kind of desperation that comes when someone realizes they've been backed into a corner with no escape route. What is he doing here? She demanded, her gaze fixing on Detective Morrison. Timothy, why is there a police officer in your mother's house? Timothy opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had been asked to explain quantum physics in a language he didn't speak. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Detective Morrison stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm Detective Morrison with Millbrook Heights Police. I'd like to ask you some questions about the cake you brought your mother-in-law this morning." The transformation in Vivienne's face was immediate and startling. The panic and desperation melted away, replaced by a mask of confused innocence that was almost convincing. Almost. "Cake?" she said, her voice rising with what sounded like genuine bewilderment. "What about the cake? I brought Eleanor a chocolate cake from Grandview Bakery." It was a surprise, a gesture of goodwill. "I don't understand what that has to do with the police." She moved into the room with renewed confidence, straightening her skirt and smoothing her hair with practiced gestures. This was the Vivienne I knew, controlled, calculating, always ready with the right words and the perfect explanation. "Eleanor," she continued, turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "surely you didn't call the police over a simple misunderstanding. If you didn't like the cake, you could have just told me." I remained seated on my sofa, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching this performance with the detached interest of someone who had finally seen behind the curtain. "The cake made Duchess very sick, Vivienne. She required emergency veterinary care." "Oh, no!" Vivienne's hand flew to her chest in an exaggerated gesture of concern. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea dogs couldn't have chocolate. I should have thought of that before giving you the cake. This is all my fault for being careless." Detective Morrison was taking notes again, his pen moving steadily across the pages. "Mrs. Ashworth, most people are aware that chocolate can be harmful to dogs. Are you saying you weren't familiar with this fact?" "Well, Vivienne faltered for just a moment before recovering. "I mean, I've heard that before, but I didn't think a small piece would hurt a big dog like Duchess. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was just so excited about the surprise." "What kind of surprise requires someone to eat cake immediately?" I asked, my voice level and calm. "You seemed quite insistent that I try it right away, on the porch, before I'd even invited you inside." Vivienne's composure cracked slightly. "I was excited for your reaction. I'd worked so hard on getting the recipe just right, and I wanted to see if you liked it while I was there." "You said you got it from Grandview Bakery," Detective Morrison noted, consulting his notebook. "But now you're saying you worked hard on the recipe?" The silence that followed was deafening. Vivienne's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish gasping for air. Her carefully constructed story was unraveling in real time, and we could all see her struggling to weave the threads back together. "I meant I worked hard choosing the right cake," she said finally. "I spent a lot of time talking to the baker about what Eleanor might like." Timothy finally found his voice. "Vivienne, just tell the truth, please. What did you put in that cake?" His wife spun around to face him, her expression shifting to wounded betrayal. "Timothy, how can you even ask me that? How can you sit there and let them accuse me of trying to hurt your mother? I love Eleanor. I've been trying for 3 years to build a relationship with her, and this is how I'm repaid?" "By trying to poison me?" I interjected, my patience finally wearing thin. "I did not try to poison anyone!" Vivienne shrieked, all pretense of control finally abandoned. "This is insane. You're all insane. I brought you a cake as a nice gesture, and you've turned it into some kind of criminal conspiracy." She began pacing the length of my living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood with sharp staccato beats that matched the rhythm of her mounting hysteria. "I've put up with your coldness for 3 years, Eleanor. 3 years of polite smiles and backhanded comments. 3 years of feeling like an outsider in my own husband's family. And now you want to destroy my life over a misunderstanding about dog food?" "It's not about dog food," I said quietly. "It's about the fact that you panicked and tried to leave the moment Duchess started showing symptoms. It's about the way you've systematically tried to isolate Timothy from his family, It's about the questions you've been asking about my health and dietary restrictions." Detective Morrison looked up from his notes. "Mrs. Ashworth, your husband mentioned that you recently asked him about his mother's food allergies. Can you tell me about that conversation?" Vivienne stopped pacing and stared at Timothy with naked fury. "You told them about that? A private conversation between husband and wife?" "Answer the question, Vivienne," Timothy said, his voice stronger than it had been all afternoon. "Why were you asking about Mom's allergies?" "Because I wanted to cook something nice for her," she exploded. "Because despite everything, I was still trying to make this family work. But clearly, that was a mistake. Clearly, nothing I do will ever be good enough for precious Eleanor and her perfect son." The venom in her voice was unmistakable now, all pretense of affection finally stripped away. Detective Morrison was writing furiously, capturing every word of her breakdown. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said calmly, "we're going to need you to come down to the station for further questioning, and I'd strongly recommend you contact a lawyer." Vivienne's face went white. She looked at Timothy with desperate eyes, searching for some sign that he would come to her rescue, that he would choose her side over mine. Instead, my son stood up slowly from his father's chair and looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, disappointment so deep it seemed to physically pain him. "Vivienne," he said quietly, "what did you do?" After Detective Morrison left with Vivienne in handcuffs and the house finally fell silent, Timothy and I sat across from each other in my living room like strangers meeting for the first time. The late afternoon sun slanted through my lace curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian rug where Timothy used to play with his toy cars as a child. But that little boy felt like a lifetime away from the broken man sitting in his father's chair, staring at his wedding ring like it had become a foreign object. "I need to understand," he said finally, his voice hoarse from the emotional upheaval of the afternoon. "Help me understand how I missed this, how I missed all of this." I rose from the sofa and walked to the antique secretary desk in the corner of the room, the same desk where I'd helped Timothy with his homework every night from kindergarten through high school. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a thick manila folder I'd been keeping for the past 3 years, a folder I'd hoped I'd never have to open. "Before I show you this," I said, returning to my seat with the folder in my lap, "I want you to know that I never wanted to be right about Vivienne. I would have given anything to be wrong, to have my suspicions proven foolish and unfounded." Timothy's eyes fixed on the folder with a mixture of dread and curiosity. "What is that?" "Documentation," I replied simply. 3 years of incidents, conversations, and patterns that I started recording after the first 6 months of your marriage, when I realized that what was happening wasn't just normal adjustment issues. I opened the folder and pulled out the first item, a small notebook with dates and detailed entries written in my careful handwriting. "This started on December 15th, 3 months after your wedding. Do you remember the Christmas party at the Hendersons that year?" Timothy nodded slowly. "Vivienne got sick and we had to leave early." "She didn't get sick, Timothy. She waited until I was in the middle of telling the story about your father's first Christmas proposal, the one with the ring hidden in the snow angel, and then suddenly developed a migraine that required immediate attention." I flipped to the entry and read aloud. "Vivienne interrupted the story 3 times with comments about how different Christmas traditions are now, then claimed severe headache when other guests asked me to continue." Timothy apologized to everyone for my, quote, lengthy storytelling, and they left within 10 minutes. Timothy's face paled. "I remember apologizing, but I thought you had been talking for a long time and maybe you didn't notice people getting restless." 23 people were gathered around listening, Timothy. Mrs. Henderson specifically asked me to tell the story because her granddaughter had just gotten engaged. No one was restless except Vivienne. I turned the page. January 8th. Your birthday dinner at Rosewood Restaurant. I had made a reservation for 3 at 7 o'clock, your favorite table by the window. Vivienne called that afternoon and changed it to 5:30, a table in the back corner, then arrived 20 minutes late, claiming traffic from a work emergency. She did have a work emergency, Timothy protested weakly. On a Saturday? At her part-time job at the boutique that closes at 4? I pulled out a receipt from the folder. I called Elegant Threads the following Monday to send flowers, thanking them for understanding about her emergency. The manager, Patricia, was confused. She said Vivienne hadn't worked Saturdays since November, and they'd been closed for inventory that entire weekend. Timothy stared at the receipt, his architect's mind clearly trying to reconcile the timeline. Why would she lie about something so small? Because it wasn't small, sweetheart, it was strategic. She wanted to ensure your birthday dinner was rushed, uncomfortable, and forgettable. She wanted you to associate spending time with me with stress and inconvenience. I pulled out more entries. February 22nd. I called to invite you both for Sunday brunch after church. Vivienne answered and said you were sick with food poisoning from something you'd eaten at my house the previous week. I did have food poisoning, Timothy said, but his voice lacked conviction. You had eaten at 3 different restaurants that week and had dinner at 2 of your colleagues' homes. But the only place Vivienne mentioned to me was my house. She made sure I felt responsible, guilty, like I'd somehow caused your illness. I turned several pages. March through August. 14 different occasions where she had sudden emergencies, unexpected work obligations, or health issues that prevented or cut short any time we spent together. I pulled out a separate stack of papers. These are the emails and text messages she sent to extended family members during your first year of marriage. I didn't ask for these. Aunt Margaret and Cousin David forwarded them to me because they were concerned. Timothy took the papers with trembling hands and began reading. I watched his expression change as he absorbed Vivienne's carefully crafted messages, subtle suggestions that I was having difficulty accepting his marriage, that I was struggling with letting go, that she was trying her best to help me through this transition, but finding it challenging. She told Margaret that you thought I was becoming forgetful and might need someone to check on me more frequently, Timothy read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. She told David that I'd made several comments about feeling lonely since you got married, and suggested he call me more often to keep my spirits up. Every word designed to paint me as a lonely, aging mother who couldn't let go of her son. She was laying groundwork, Timothy, creating a narrative that would explain away any concerns I might voice about her behavior. I pulled out a small recording device from the folder. This is from your second Christmas together. Vivienne thought I was in the kitchen when she made this call to her sister Camille. I pressed play, and Vivienne's voice filled the room, clear and calculating. It's going exactly as planned. Timothy feels guilty every time he chooses to spend time with Eleanor, instead of focusing on our marriage. I've been documenting every instance where he prioritizes her needs over mine. Eventually, he'll see that he has to choose between being a good husband and being a mama's boy. And when that choice comes, I'll make sure there's only one right answer. Timothy dropped the papers and pressed his hands to his face. Oh God, oh my God, Mom. How long have you known? Known for certain? Since that phone call. Suspected? Since the engagement party, when she told everyone I'd been giving her wedding planning advice, then pulled me aside later to inform me that she didn't actually want my input but felt sorry for me because I seemed so eager to be involved. I gathered the papers back into the folder, each document representing a small wound that had accumulated into something much larger over time. Timothy, I want you to understand something. I didn't collect this evidence because I wanted to prove Vivienne was terrible. I collected it because I was starting to doubt my own perceptions. You were so happy, so convinced that I was the problem, that I began to wonder if I was imagining things. Why didn't you show me this before? He asked, his voice breaking. Because you weren't ready to see it. Because every time I tried to express concerns, Vivienne had already primed you to view them as jealousy or manipulation on my part. Because I knew that if I pushed too hard, I'd lose you completely. I leaned forward, catching his eyes. And because I hoped that eventually you'd see it for yourself. Timothy was quiet for a long time, staring at the folder that contained 3 years of systematic manipulation and emotional warfare. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red with unshed tears. "She almost killed you today," he said, "and I've been helping her isolate you for 3 years. I've been her accomplice without even knowing it." You were her victim too, Timothy. Manipulation works because it's subtle. Because it makes you doubt your own instincts and rely on someone else's version of reality. He stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the street where Vivienne's car still sat in my driveway like evidence of the life we'd all been living until this afternoon changed everything. How do I come back from this, Mom? How do I rebuild what I've destroyed? Over the next hour, as the shadows lengthened across my living room floor, Timothy and I went through the folder page by page, incident by incident, until the full scope of Vivienne's campaign became undeniable. It wasn't just the big moments I'd documented. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small cuts, each one designed to bleed me out of my son's life drop by drop. "Look at this pattern," I said, spreading out 12 months' worth of calendar entries across my coffee table. Every major holiday, every family milestone, every birthday, she found a way to either exclude me entirely or make my presence so uncomfortable that you'd start to dread including me. Timothy picked up the entry from his father's death anniversary last year. His hands shook as he read my careful documentation. March 12th. Timothy called to ask if I wanted to visit Robert's grave together, as we've done every year since he passed. Vivienne answered his phone, said he was in the shower, took a message, called back 30 minutes later to say Timothy felt it would be, quote, healthier to create new traditions instead of dwelling on sad memories. Suggested I might benefit from grief counseling instead of relying on Timothy for emotional support on difficult days. "I never said that," Timothy whispered. "I never said any of that. I waited for you to call back about Dad's anniversary. When you didn't, I thought you wanted to handle it privately this year. She told me you needed space to process your grief without me reminding you of painful memories." I pulled out another document. 3 days later, she posted photos on social media of you both at some kind of wellness retreat, with captions about healing and moving forward, and, quote, creating positive new memories. Timothy's face crumpled. The retreat was her idea. She said I seemed depressed and needed a change of scenery. I felt guilty the entire time because I kept thinking about how I should be with you instead. That was the point, sweetheart. She wanted you to feel guilty no matter what choice you made. I showed him a printed screenshot of Vivienne's Facebook post from that weekend, all soft lighting and inspirational quotes about letting go of the past. "Look at the comments." She responded to every person who asked about our family traditions by saying things like, "We're helping Timothy develop healthier coping mechanisms," and, quote, "Eleanor is very private about her grief process." We continued through the evidence chronologically, and I watched Timothy's face transform as he recognized manipulation technique after manipulation technique. The birthday party where she'd invited his entire extended family except me, then told everyone I was taking some time for myself. The Thanksgiving where she'd volunteered us to travel to her family in Portland, booking flights before asking Timothy, then presenting it as a done deal because Eleanor probably has her own traditions anyway. "Here's what really shows the calculation," I said, pulling out a separate folder labeled Medical and Emergency Incidents. "Every time she prevented you from seeing me or forced you to choose between us, she followed up with what I call hero moments. Situations where she appeared to be taking care of me or showing concern for my well-being." Timothy looked at the first entry, dated just 2 weeks after the blocked anniversary visit. March 26th. Vivienne called to check on my blood pressure medication refill, said she was worried because I'd seemed off during our last conversation, offered to pick up prescriptions or drive me to doctor's appointments. Made sure to mention this concern to Timothy, asking him to watch for signs that I might be declining. "I remember this," Timothy said slowly. "She was so worried about you. She said you'd seemed confused during a phone call, maybe forgetting things. She made me promise to pay closer attention to your health." I was never confused, Timothy, but she planted the seed that I might be developing cognitive issues, which served 2 purposes. It made her look caring and attentive, and it gave her a way to dismiss anything I might say later as potential early dementia symptoms. I showed him entry after entry documenting this pattern. Vivienne calling to express concern about my driving after dark, then suggesting to Timothy that he should probably start monitoring my activities more closely. Vivienne mentioning to extended family that she was worried about me living alone in such a big house, then graciously offering to help research assisted living facilities when I was ready. Vivienne bringing up my increasing isolation to neighbors, positioning herself as the concerned daughter-in-law trying to help a stubborn elderly woman who wouldn't accept assistance. She was building a case, Timothy realized, his voice hollow, creating a narrative where you were declining and I was negligent for not seeing it. And she was the hero, the caring daughter-in-law who was trying to protect you from the burden of dealing with a difficult aging mother. I pulled out a thick stack of printed text messages. These are from her sister Camille, forwarded to me by Margaret after Camille accidentally sent them to the wrong number during a family group text mix-up. Timothy read through the messages, his face growing paler with each screenshot. She's telling Camille that you're becoming demanding and needy, that you call constantly with minor complaints to get attention, that you guilt-trip me into visiting by making up health scares. None of which ever happened. But look at the dates. I pointed to the timestamps. Every single one of these messages was sent within 24 hours of a positive interaction between us. After you and I had dinner and talked for 3 hours about your work projects, she told Camille you came home exhausted because I'd monopolized your evening with my problems. After you helped me plant the new rose bushes and we laughed about Dad's terrible gardening advice, she complained to her sister that I was using manual labor requests to manipulate you into spending time with me. We found the pattern everywhere once we started looking for it. Timothy would have a good day with me, would remember why he enjoyed our relationship, would feel close to his family again, and within hours, Vivienne would reframe the entire experience as evidence of my neediness, my manipulation, my inability to respect boundaries. "Look at this one," Timothy said, his voice barely controlled. He was reading a text from Vivienne to her mother dated last Christmas morning. "She's complaining that you gave me Dad's vintage watch as a gift, saying it was emotionally manipulative timing and that I was too polite to tell you I didn't want a constant reminder of death on my wrist." "You cried when I gave you that watch," I said softly. "You said it made you feel close to Dad, that you'd always hoped I'd pass it down to you someday." "I did cry, happy tears, I wear it every day." He held up his wrist, showing his father's worn leather band and silver face. "I told her it was the most meaningful gift I'd ever received." "But she told her family you were just being polite, that you felt burdened by my expectations and emotional neediness. She was rewriting your own feelings and experiences, making you seem like a victim of my manipulation rather than a son who loved his mother." Timothy stood up and began pacing, the same nervous energy I'd seen in him as a child when he was trying to solve a particularly difficult problem. "How many people has she told these lies to? How many of our friends and family members think I'm trapped in some unhealthy relationship with my mother?" I pulled out the final section of the folder, a collection of emails and social media screenshots that painted a picture of systematic reputation destruction. Vivienne had spent 3 years carefully poisoning the well, telling everyone in our social circle subtle variations of the same story. I was a lonely widow who couldn't let go of her son, Timothy was too kind and respectful to set proper boundaries, and she was doing her best to help him navigate this difficult family dynamic. "She told your colleagues at work that I called you multiple times a day," I said, showing him a forwarded email from his architectural firm's office manager. "She mentioned to the neighbors that you felt obligated to check on me daily because I was struggling with depression after Dad's death. She informed our church congregation that I was having a hard time accepting your marriage and that she was trying to be patient while I adjusted." Timothy read through everything, the 3-year campaign laid out in black and white. When he finished, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "She didn't just try to poison you today," he said finally. "She's been poisoning everyone against you for 3 years. She's been poisoning me against you, making me doubt my own feelings about our relationship." The cake was just the final escalation, I agreed. When subtle manipulation wasn't working fast enough, when you started pushing back against some of her restrictions, she decided to remove the problem permanently. Timothy looked at me with eyes full of pain and regret. How do I tell people the truth? How do I explain that everything they think they know about our family is based on lies? The breakthrough came at 7:30 that evening, just as the last light was fading from my living room windows. Timothy had been sitting in silence for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the evidence spread across my coffee table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that finally revealed its complete picture. When he looked up at me, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The fog of confusion and manipulation had lifted, replaced by a clarity that was both painful and liberating. "I can see it now," he said, his voice steady for the first time all day. "I can see exactly how she did it, and more importantly, I can see how she's still doing it. Even now, even while she's sitting in a police station being questioned about attempted murder, part of me is worried about her. Part of me is making excuses for her behavior." I nodded, recognizing the moment when a victim of psychological manipulation finally understands the depth of their conditioning. "That's how effective she's been, Timothy. She's trained you to prioritize her emotional needs over your own instincts, over your own family, even over evidence of criminal behavior." He stood and walked to the mantelpiece where photographs of our family history lined the shelf. Pictures of him as a baby, his father and me on our wedding day, Timothy's college graduation, family vacations, birthday celebrations. His fingers traced the edge of a frame containing his favorite photo of his father, taken just 6 months before Robert died. "You know what the worst part is?" Timothy said without turning around. "I can remember the exact moment when I stopped trusting myself and started trusting her version of reality instead." "Tell me," I said gently. "It was about 8 months after we got married. You had called to invite us for Sunday dinner, and I was excited because you were making Dad's favorite pot roast recipe. But when I told Vivienne, she got this look on her face. Not angry, not upset, just sad, disappointed, like I'd let her down in some fundamental way." Timothy turned back to face me, and I could see him reliving that moment with new understanding. "She said she was happy that I wanted to spend time with you, but she was hurt that I seemed more excited about dinner with my mother than about the romantic evening she'd planned for us. She said she felt like she was competing with you for my attention, and that maybe she'd misunderstood what marriage was supposed to be like." "And you felt guilty," I said, because I could see it playing out in his expression. Terrible guilt. Here was my new wife, trying to build a life with me, and I was prioritizing my mother's pot roast over her feelings. "So I called you back and canceled, made some excuse about work, and Vivienne was so grateful, so loving that evening, that I felt like I'd made the right choice." "But you felt wrong about it too," I observed. "Yes, but I told myself that was just adjustment. Marriage meant putting my wife first, even when it felt uncomfortable. Vivienne helped me understand that my discomfort was just resistance to growing up, to becoming a real husband instead of a mama's boy." Timothy sat back down, but this time he looked directly at me instead of staring at the evidence. That was the template she used for everything that came after. Make me feel guilty for wanting something that didn't center her, then reward me for choosing her instead. Over and over, until I stopped even having the initial desire to see you or talk to you or include you in our life. I watched my son working through the mechanics of his own psychological conditioning and felt a mixture of pride in his insight and heartbreak for what he'd endured. She was systematic about it. Completely systematic. And brilliant, in the most twisted way possible. He picked up one of the documented incidents from the coffee table. "Look at this entry from my promotion celebration last year. I wanted to take you and Vivienne out to dinner together to celebrate, but Vivienne said she thought it would be more meaningful if we kept it intimate, just the two of us. Then she planned this elaborate evening that was so over-the-top romantic that I felt guilty for even thinking about including anyone else. But you called me the next day and apologized for not including me, I remembered. Because I felt bad about it. Some part of me knew it was wrong to exclude you from major life events. But when I mentioned that to Vivienne, she got upset and said my guilt proved that I wasn't emotionally available for our marriage. She said healthy husbands don't feel guilty about prioritizing their wives. Timothy was speaking faster now, as if years of suppressed observations were finally finding voice. Every time I had a natural impulse to include you or spend time with you, she reframed it as evidence of emotional immaturity or unhealthy attachment. Every time I felt bad about excluding you, she told me that guilt was proof I needed to work harder on setting appropriate boundaries. She weaponized your own conscience against you, I said. Exactly. And the more I tried to be a good husband, by her definition, the more isolated I became from everyone else who mattered to me. It wasn't just you. I lost touch with my college friends, my work buddies, even my cousins. Anyone who might remind me of who I was before Vivienne became the center of my universe. He stood up again and began pacing, energy building as connections continued forming in his mind. She controlled my entire social world. Every friend I made had to pass her approval test. Every activity I wanted to pursue had to align with her vision of our life together. Every conversation I had with other people got filtered through her interpretation afterward. How did she do that? I asked, though I suspected I knew. She'd ask innocent questions. How was your lunch with Derek? Did he seem happy in his marriage? I hope he's not one of those men who complains about his wife to other married men. Or, your mother seemed tired when she called. Do you think she's taking care of herself? Maybe we should suggest she see a doctor for those memory issues she's been having. Timothy's voice took on a mocking tone as he imitated Vivienne's concerned inflection. She never directly told me not to see people or not to trust them. She just planted seeds of doubt and let me draw my own conclusions. Made me think I was making independent decisions when really I was just following her carefully laid breadcrumbs. And because the manipulation was so subtle, you didn't recognize it as manipulation, I said. I thought I was lucky to have such a perceptive wife, someone who could help me see things I might miss. When she pointed out that Derek seemed bitter about his marriage, I thought she was helping me avoid negative influences. When she suggested you might be having health issues, I thought she was being caring and observant. Timothy sat back down and picked up the recording device that contained Vivienne's conversation with her sister. But this changes everything. This proves that every concern she raised, every observation she made, every piece of advice she gave me, was calculated manipulation designed to isolate me from people who might help me see the truth. What truth? I asked. That I was married to someone who saw love as a zero-sum game. Someone who believed that for her to have all of me, everyone else had to have none of me. His voice grew stronger, more certain. Someone who was willing to poison my mother rather than risk losing control over my life. The room fell quiet as the full weight of that realization settled between us. Timothy had spent 3 years believing he was learning to be a better husband, when in reality he'd been systematically programmed to abandon everyone who loved him in favor of someone who saw him as a possession to be controlled. Timothy, I said carefully, what does this mean for your marriage? He looked at me with eyes that were clear and determined for the first time in years. It means I've been living in a prison disguised as a love story, and now that I can see the bars, I can never pretend they're not there. And what are you going to do about that? Whatever it takes to get free, he said. And whatever it takes to protect you from ever having to deal with anything like this again. For the first time since he'd married Vivienne, my son looked like himself again. Not the carefully controlled version she'd shaped him into, but the strong, independent man his father and I had raised him to be. The awakening was complete. What followed over the next 3 days was not revenge, but rather what I could only describe as surgical precision. Timothy approached the dismantling of his life with Vivienne the same way he approached his architectural projects, methodically, systematically, with careful attention to every structural detail that needed to be addressed. The first thing he did was change every password she had access to. Not just the obvious ones like his bank accounts and email, but the subtle infiltrations she'd accumulated over 3 years of marriage. His work computer login, his gym membership account, his subscription services, even his grocery store rewards card. Timothy realized that Vivienne had built a comprehensive surveillance network of his daily life, monitoring everything from his spending patterns to his entertainment choices. She knew what I ate for lunch every day because she had access to my credit card statements, Timothy explained as we sat in my kitchen Wednesday morning, drinking coffee and planning his next moves. She knew what podcasts I listened to because she'd linked our Spotify accounts. She could see every email I sent and received because she'd convinced me to add her to my phone's family sharing plan, which gave her backup access to everything. I watched my son work through each digital connection with the focused intensity I remembered from his teenage years when he'd build complex model airplanes. But instead of glue and plastic pieces, he was dismantling the architecture of his own imprisonment, one password change at a time. The joint accounts are more complicated, he continued, showing me a legal pad covered with notes and account numbers. Harold says I can freeze them temporarily while we sort out what belongs to whom, but I need to be strategic about timing. If I move too fast, her lawyer could claim I'm hiding assets. If I move too slowly, she might empty them first. We had learned that morning that Vivienne had been released on bail thanks to her father's connections and a high-powered attorney who specialized in cases involving what he euphemistically called domestic misunderstandings. The thought of her free and potentially planning her next move had motivated Timothy to accelerate his timeline. Harold recommended a forensic accountant, Timothy said, pulling out a business card. Someone who can trace exactly where our money has been going for the past 3 years. He says in cases like this, financial manipulation usually runs deeper than people realize. As if summoned by our conversation, Timothy's phone buzzed with a text message. His face darkened as he read it, then turned the screen toward me. The message was from Vivienne. I know you're angry and confused right now, but please don't make any permanent decisions while you're emotional. We can work through this together. I love you. Even now, Timothy said, his voice filled with disgust. Even after being arrested for trying to poison you, she's still trying to manipulate me. Still positioning herself as the reasonable one, while implying that I'm being irrational. What are you going to do? I asked. Nothing. Harold said not to respond to any communication from her directly. Everything goes through lawyers now. Timothy deleted the message without responding. But I am going to do something else. He pulled out his laptop and opened his social media accounts. For the next hour, I watched my son methodically document 3 years of lies. Not with emotional accusations or angry rants, but with the same careful precision he'd used to change his passwords. Each post was factual, measured, and supported by evidence. Facebook first, he said, typing steadily. I'm posting the timeline of events from yesterday, including the police report number and Detective Morrison's contact information. Anyone who wants to verify the facts can do so themselves. The post was stunning in its simplicity. Yesterday, my wife was arrested for attempted murder after bringing a poisoned cake to my mother's home. My mother survived because she fed the cake to our dog first, and the dog became violently ill. This is not a misunderstanding or a family dispute. This is a criminal matter being handled by Millbrook Heights police. I am sharing this information because my wife has spent 3 years telling our friends and family a very different story about our family dynamics, and I believe people deserve to know the truth. Within minutes, the comments began pouring in. Shock, disbelief, offers of support, and tellingly, several messages from people who admitted they'd never felt comfortable around Vivienne but hadn't been able to articulate why. Instagram next, Timothy said, posting a similar message along with a photo of Duchess looking healthy and alert in my garden. Then LinkedIn, because she made sure everyone at my firm thought you were some kind of burden on my life. But Timothy's most strategic move came when he called his boss, Marcus Chen, the senior partner at Ashworth and Associates Architects, and requested an immediate meeting. Timothy had been with the firm for 8 years, had brought in millions of dollars in contracts, and was being considered for partnership. His professional reputation was spotless, which made his next conversation all the more impactful. "I told Marcus everything," Timothy explained when he returned from the office that afternoon, "not just about yesterday, but about the pattern of lies Vivienne had been spreading about our family. I showed him some of the documentation from your folder, the evidence of how she'd been systematically destroying relationships." How did he react? He was furious. Apparently, Vivienne had made several calls to the office over the past year, expressing concern about my, quote, emotional stability, and suggesting that I was under too much stress trying to manage my career and my mother's increasing neediness. She'd positioned herself as the concerned wife trying to help the firm understand why my performance might be declining. Timothy's jaw tightened as he continued. "Except my performance wasn't declining. I've been one of their top performers for 3 years running." Marcus said he'd found her calls strange, but hadn't wanted to interfere in what seemed like family issues. Now he realizes she was trying to sabotage my career prospects by planting seeds of doubt about my professional reliability. The strategic brilliance of Vivienne's approach was becoming clearer. She hadn't just isolated Timothy from his personal relationships. She'd been undermining his professional standing as well, ensuring that if he ever tried to leave her, he'd have nowhere solid to land. "Marcus is documenting everything," Timothy said. "He's also reaching out to other partners and senior staff to see if Vivienne made similar calls to them. If there's a pattern of workplace interference, it could be relevant to the criminal case." But perhaps Timothy's most decisive action came that evening, when he drafted a letter to every person Vivienne had contacted over the past 3 years with her carefully crafted stories about our family dysfunction. Using the evidence from my folder, he created individualized letters that addressed the specific lies she'd told each person, providing context and documentation to set the record straight. "This isn't about revenge," Timothy explained as he sealed envelope after envelope. "This is about accountability. These people made decisions about how to interact with our family based on false information. They deserve to know they were lied to." The letter to his Aunt Margaret was particularly detailed, addressing how Vivienne had convinced her that I was becoming forgetful and needed monitoring, when in reality I'd been sharper and more observant than ever. The letter to his colleague Derek explained how Vivienne had suggested I was emotionally manipulative and prone to creating drama, when the truth was that I'd been carefully documenting her behavior for legal protection. "She spent 3 years building a narrative," Timothy said as he prepared to mail the letters. "Now I'm going to dismantle it, piece by piece, with the same systematic approach she used to create it." By the end of that 3rd day, Timothy had effectively reversed 3 years of isolation and manipulation. His accounts were secure, his professional reputation was protected, his social connections were being rebuilt on honest foundations, and most importantly, he'd created a paper trail that would support whatever legal proceedings lay ahead. "The beautiful thing about the truth," Timothy said as we finished addressing the last envelope, "is that it doesn't require coordination or careful timing or strategic manipulation. It just requires the courage to tell it." As I watched my son take control of his life with such methodical precision, I realized that Vivienne had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that 3 years of conditioning would be enough to keep Timothy loyal even in the face of attempted murder. Instead, her escalation had shattered the illusion completely, freeing him to act with the full force of his considerable intelligence and determination. The student had become the master, and now Vivienne was about to discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of truly strategic thinking. The domino effect of Timothy's truth-telling campaign began within hours of his first social media post and accelerated throughout the week like an avalanche gaining momentum. What started as individual responses to his revelations quickly became a coordinated reckoning, as people across our community began comparing notes and realizing the scope of Vivienne's deception. The first major crack appeared Thursday morning when Vivienne's sister Camille called me directly. I hadn't spoken to Camille in over 2 years. She'd gradually distanced herself from family gatherings after Vivienne had convinced her that I made Timothy uncomfortable and that she should limit contact to avoid putting him in awkward positions. "Eleanor, I owe you the biggest apology of my life," Camille said, her voice thick with tears. "I just read Timothy's post, and I've been up all night going through old text messages from Vivienne. I need you to know that everything I thought I knew about your relationship with Timothy was a lie." Camille's call lasted nearly 2 hours, as she detailed 3 years of conversations with Vivienne that had painted me as an overbearing, manipulative mother who refused to accept Timothy's marriage. But more importantly, Camille revealed that she wasn't the only family member who'd been receiving these carefully crafted updates. She had a whole system, Camille explained. She'd call Mom and tell her one version of events, call me with slightly different details, and tell Aunt Patricia something else entirely. Then she'd compare our responses and adjust her story based on what worked best with each audience. By Thursday afternoon, a group chat had formed among Timothy's extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends who had all received some version of Vivienne's anti-Eleanor propaganda over the years. As they shared screenshots and compared timelines, a disturbing pattern emerged that went far beyond simple gossip. "Look at these dates," Timothy said, showing me the coordinated messages on his phone. "Every time you and I had a good interaction, within 24 hours, Vivienne was contacting multiple family members with quote, concerns about your behavior or my well-being. It wasn't random complaining. It was a systematic campaign to turn everyone against you." The revelation that shook our family the most came from Timothy's cousin Rebecca, who worked as a social worker and had been quietly documenting her own concerns about Vivienne's behavior. Rebecca had noticed that Vivienne's stories about family dysfunction followed textbook patterns of psychological manipulation, but she'd hesitated to speak up because the accusations seemed so serious. "I should have said something sooner," Rebecca admitted during a family video call that evening. But Vivienne was so convincing, so detailed in her accounts. She had dates, specific conversations, even what seemed like supporting evidence. I started to doubt my own professional judgment. What Rebecca had documented was even more disturbing than what I'd collected in my folder. She'd noticed that Vivienne's stories about me followed classic emotional abuse patterns, isolation tactics, gaslighting techniques, and something called triangulation, where she'd pit family members against each other by sharing different versions of the same events. "She told me you were becoming paranoid and suspicious, that you'd accused her of trying to steal Timothy away from you," Rebecca said. "She told Cousin David that you were making unreasonable demands on Timothy's time and becoming angry when he set boundaries. She told Aunt Margaret that you were having memory issues and getting confused about conversations that never happened." But Rebecca's most damning observation was about timing. Every story Vivienne told us was designed to make us less likely to believe you if you ever tried to tell us what was really happening. She was preemptively discrediting you, making sure that if you complained about her behavior, we'd dismiss it as the paranoid ramblings of a jealous mother-in-law. The consequences weren't limited to family relationships. By Friday, the ripple effects had reached Vivienne's professional and social circles as well. Dr. Amanda Foster, Vivienne's supervisor at the boutique where she worked part-time, called Timothy after reading his social media posts. "I need to tell you something that's been bothering me for months," Dr. Foster said. "Vivienne has been telling customers and coworkers that she's dealing with a difficult family situation involving an elderly relative with early-stage dementia. She's used this story to explain away times when she seemed distracted or emotional at work." The boutique revelation led to even more discoveries. Vivienne had been using her fake concern about my declining mental health to gain sympathy and special accommodations at work, at the gym, even at the grocery store where she was a regular customer. Store managers who had bent rules for her, workout partners who had covered for her missed classes, even the mailman who had been delivering packages to her personally instead of leaving them at the door. All because she'd convinced them she was the devoted daughter-in-law caring for a difficult elderly woman. "She turned your supposed dementia into a part-time job," Timothy said with disgust. "She was getting perks, sympathy, and special treatment from dozens of people by lying about your condition." The most shocking revelation came from Detective Morrison, who called Friday evening with updates on the criminal investigation. The forensic analysis of the cake had revealed not just one toxic substance, but a carefully calculated combination designed to mimic the symptoms of a stroke or heart attack. "This wasn't a crime of passion," Detective Morrison explained. "The substances found in the cake required advanced planning and specific knowledge of dosages. Mrs. Vivienne Ashworth researched this method extensively. We found her search history going back 6 months. Queries about untraceable poisons, how to make deaths look like natural causes. Even specific searches about elderly women's vulnerability to certain cardiac events." The detective's findings painted a picture of premeditation that was chilling in its scope. Vivienne hadn't just decided to poison me that Tuesday morning. She'd been planning my murder for half a year, researching methods, timing, and cover stories with the same systematic approach she'd used for everything else. "We also found evidence that she'd been documenting your mother's daily routines," Detective Morrison continued. "Photos of her house taken from various angles, notes about when she typically received visitors, even observations about your dog's behavior patterns. She knew exactly when and how to approach with minimal risk of witnesses." But perhaps the most devastating consequence for Vivienne was the collapse of her carefully constructed public image. The boutique fired her immediately after learning about the false dementia story. Her gym revoked her membership for violating their community trust policies. Even her longtime hairdresser Maria posted on social media about feeling betrayed by years of lies about family drama that had never existed. "The narcissist's worst nightmare," Rebecca observed during another family call, "is having their true nature exposed to everyone they've been manipulating." Vivienne spent 3 years building a reputation as the long-suffering, patient daughter-in-law. Now everyone knows she's actually a calculating would-be murderer who lied to their faces for years. Timothy's phone buzzed constantly with messages from people who wanted to apologize, to share their own stories of feeling manipulated by Vivienne, or simply to express their shock at how thoroughly they'd been deceived. Former friends admitted they'd always felt uncomfortable around her but couldn't pinpoint why. Neighbors revealed they'd thought something was off about her stories, but hadn't wanted to interfere in family business. "It's like she cast a spell over our entire community," Timothy marveled as he scrolled through the messages. "And now that the spell is broken, everyone can see her clearly for the first time." The most satisfying consequence, from my perspective, was watching Vivienne's support network evaporate in real time. Her sister Camille blocked her number after discovering the extent of the lies. Her parents, initially defensive, began distancing themselves after Detective Morrison shared evidence of the premeditated nature of the poisoning attempt. Even her high-powered attorneys seemed to be reconsidering his aggressive defense strategy as more evidence of her systematic deception came to light. By Sunday, 1 week after the poisoned cake incident, Vivienne had gone from being a respected member of our community to being completely isolated. The same fate she had spent 3 years trying to engineer for me. The difference was that her isolation was the natural consequence of her own actions being exposed, while mine had been the artificial result of her manipulation campaign. "She wanted to make you disappear from Timothy's life," Camille observed during our final conversation that week. "Instead, she made herself disappear from everyone's life. There's a certain poetic justice in that." 2 weeks after the poisoned cake incident, Vivienne made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. She arrived at my house on a gray Tuesday morning, somehow having convinced her bail supervisor to allow the visit under the pretense of retrieving essential personal items that Timothy had supposedly withheld from her. But I knew better than to believe anything Vivienne said anymore, and when I saw her walking up my cobblestone path with that familiar determined stride, I was ready. I had been expecting this confrontation since the moment Detective Morrison told us about her bail. Vivienne was a chess player who thought several moves ahead, and she wouldn't simply accept defeat without attempting one final gambit. What I hadn't anticipated was how dramatically different she would look after 2 weeks of having her carefully constructed world collapse around her. Gone was the immaculate grooming that had always been her trademark. Her blonde hair, usually styled to perfection, hung limply around her shoulders with dark roots showing through. Her clothes, while still expensive, were wrinkled and ill-fitting, as if she'd lost weight rapidly. But most striking were her eyes. The calculating coldness I'd learned to recognize had been replaced by something wild and desperate, the look of someone who had run out of moves but refused to surrender the game. I opened the door before she could knock, just as I had with Timothy 2 weeks earlier. But this time, my calm was not natural. It was carefully cultivated armor that I'd spent 14 days preparing. I had rehearsed this moment, planned for every possible approach she might take, every manipulation technique she might deploy. "Hello, Vivienne," I said, my voice steady and neutral. "I assume you're here to try to convince me to drop the charges." Her mask of controlled composure slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing surprise that I had anticipated her purpose so directly. But she recovered quickly, forcing her face back into an expression of wounded innocence that might have worked 2 weeks ago but now looked obviously artificial. "Eleanor, please," she said, her voice trembling with what was supposed to sound like genuine emotion. "Can we just talk, woman to woman, mother to daughter? There's been such a terrible misunderstanding, and I think if we could just sit down together we could work this out." "The only misunderstanding," I replied, not moving from my doorway, "was my thinking you were merely manipulative instead of homicidal. The police lab results cleared that up quite definitively." Vivienne's carefully prepared speech seemed to falter. She had clearly expected me to invite her in, to give her an opportunity to work her psychological magic in the comfortable setting of my living room. Instead, she found herself forced to make her case while standing on my porch like a door-to-door salesperson whose product nobody wanted. "The cake was never meant to hurt you," she said, shifting tactics to what I recognized as her standard deflection strategy. "Yes, I made a mistake with the ingredients, but it was an accident. You have to believe me, Eleanor. I would never intentionally harm you." "Which ingredients were the accident?" I asked. "The oleander extract that causes cardiac arrest, or the antifreeze compounds that cause organ failure? Because according to Detective Morrison, you researched both of those substances extensively over the past 6 months." Her face went completely white. She hadn't expected me to know the specific details of her poison cocktail, and hearing her research thrown back at her seemed to shake her confidence further. But Vivienne had spent 3 years perfecting her manipulation techniques, and she wasn't ready to abandon them yet. "Eleanor, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be upset about what happened to poor Duchess," she said, attempting to redirect the conversation toward my emotional vulnerability. "But think about Timothy. Think about what this is doing to him. He's falling apart without me. He needs stability in his life, not a lengthy criminal trial that will destroy both our futures." I almost laughed at the audacity. Even facing attempted murder charges, even with her entire social network collapsed and her reputation in ruins, she was still trying to use my love for Timothy as a weapon against me. "Timothy is doing remarkably well, actually," I said. "Better than he's done in 3 years. It's amazing how much happier someone can be when they're no longer being systematically isolated from everyone who loves them." "You turned him against me," Vivienne hissed, and for the first time her true anger showed through the false vulnerability. "You couldn't stand that he chose me over you, so you poisoned his mind with lies and paranoid accusations." "I didn't turn Timothy against you, Vivienne. You did that yourself when you decided to try to murder his mother." I pulled out my phone and showed her Timothy's latest text message, sent just that morning, a photo of him and Duchess playing in my garden, with the caption, "Home where I belong." He's not falling apart, he's healing. The sight of that photo seemed to break something fundamental in Vivienne's psyche. The last pretense of control evaporated, and what emerged was raw, undiluted rage that she had kept hidden beneath years of careful manipulation. "You selfish bitch," she snarled, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You couldn't let me have him. You couldn't let me build a life with my husband without your constant interference. Everything was perfect, until you started filling his head with doubts about me." "Everything was perfect for you," I corrected. Timothy was miserable, isolated from his family and friends, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering your emotional manipulations. "But that was perfect for you because it meant total control." "I gave him everything," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of composure. "I made him successful. I gave him confidence. I helped him become the man he is today. And you want to destroy that because you can't accept that he doesn't need you anymore. You tried to poison me, Vivienne. You researched methods for months, planned the timing carefully, and brought a cake specifically designed to kill me. That's not love for Timothy. That's obsession with possession." For a moment, she stood there in stunned silence, as if she'd never heard her actions described so plainly. Then her face twisted into something I'd never seen before. Pure, undisguised hatred. "Fine," she said, her voice now completely calm and cold. "You want to know the truth? Yes, I wanted you gone. Yes, I planned it carefully. Because Timothy will never be completely mine as long as you are alive to remind him of who he was before me." The confession hung in the air between us like a physical thing. She had finally dropped all pretense, all manipulation, all careful psychological strategy. In her desperation to hurt me, she had given me exactly what the prosecutor would need to ensure her conviction. "The difference between us, Vivienne," I said, pulling out the digital recorder I'd been carrying in my pocket, "is that I love Timothy enough to want him to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't center around me. You love the idea of Timothy, but only as your possession." Her eyes widened as she saw the recorder, realizing that her confession had been captured. For the first time in our entire relationship, Vivienne looked genuinely afraid. "You can't use that," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I didn't consent to being recorded." "Actually, I can. Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state. And you're currently on my property, making threats related to an ongoing criminal case." I stopped the recording and slipped the device back into my pocket. "Detective Morrison will be very interested in your admission of premeditation." Vivienne stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind racing, trying to find some angle, some manipulation, some way to regain control of the situation. But there was nothing left. Her careful facade was completely destroyed, her support network was gone, her husband had seen through her lies, and now she had confessed to attempted murder on tape. "You think you've won?" she said finally, her voice flat and defeated. "But Timothy will never forgive himself for choosing you over me. Every day for the rest of his life he'll remember that he destroyed his marriage to save his mommy." "Timothy didn't destroy his marriage," I replied. "You did, the moment you decided that love meant ownership and that your happiness required my death." With that, I stepped back into my house and closed the door, leaving Vivienne standing alone on my porch with the wreckage of the life she had built on lies and manipulation. Through my window, I watched her walk slowly back to her car, her shoulders slumped in defeat, looking like someone who had finally run out of games to play. 20 minutes later, Detective Morrison called to tell me that Vivienne's bail had been revoked, and she was back in custody. Apparently, visiting me had violated the terms of her release, and my recording of her confession had convinced the judge that she posed a continued threat to public safety. The final confrontation was over, and for the first time in 3 years, I knew that my family was truly safe from Vivienne's manipulations. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen, making chocolate chip cookies with my granddaughter Emma, Timothy's 4-year-old daughter from his new relationship with Sarah, a kind pediatric nurse he'd met during Duchess's follow-up veterinary appointments. The irony wasn't lost on me that chocolate, the very substance Vivienne had tried to use as my poison had become the foundation for some of my happiest memories since her conviction. "Grandma Eleanor, can I lick the spoon?" Emma asked, her small hands covered in flour and her dark curls bouncing as she stood on the step stool beside me. Her eyes were the same warm brown as Timothy's, but they held a lightness and trust that my son's eyes had lost during his years with Vivienne and were only now beginning to recover. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, handing her the wooden spoon coated with cookie dough, "but save some room for the cookies when they come out of the oven." Through my kitchen window, I could see Timothy and Sarah sitting on my back porch, sharing a quiet conversation while Duchess dozed contentedly at their feet. My golden retriever had made a complete recovery from her poisoning, and her resilience had become something of a symbol for our family's healing process. Sarah was gently rubbing Timothy's shoulders as he talked, and I could see the difference in his posture, relaxed, open, no longer carrying the constant tension that had defined his presence during the Vivienne years. The transformation in Timothy over the past 6 months had been remarkable to witness. The divorce had been swift and decisive, with Vivienne's recorded confession making any attempt at contested proceedings impossible. She had been sentenced to 12 years in prison for attempted murder, aggravated assault, and what the prosecutor called systematic psychological abuse with intent to isolate and control. The judge had been particularly harsh in her sentencing, noting that Vivienne's manipulation campaign had endangered not just me, but Timothy's mental health and our entire family's well-being. The defendant's actions represent a calculated assault on the fundamental bonds that hold families together, Judge Patricia Hernandez had said during sentencing. Her crime wasn't just attempted murder. It was the attempted destruction of a mother-son relationship that had been built over 31 years of love and trust. Timothy had attended every day of the trial, sitting beside me in the courtroom, as witness after witness testified about Vivienne's lies and manipulations. It had been painful for him to hear the full scope of her deception laid out in legal detail, but he'd insisted on being present for all of it. "I need to understand exactly what she did," he'd told me during a break in testimony. "Not just to you, but to me, to our family, to everyone she touched. I need to see the complete picture so I can make sure I never allow something like this to happen again." The most powerful testimony had come from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a clinical psychologist who specialized in cases of psychological manipulation and abuse. Dr. Martinez had analyzed 3 years' worth of Vivienne's behavior patterns and communications, creating what she called a textbook example of systematic isolation and control. The defendant's approach was sophisticated and methodical, Dr. Martinez had explained to the jury. She identified every meaningful relationship in Mr. Ashworth's life and systematically undermined each one through carefully crafted lies and emotional manipulation. Her goal wasn't simply to have his attention. It was to ensure that she became his only source of emotional support, validation, and social connection. The prosecution had used my documentation folder as primary evidence, and I'd felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that 3 years of careful record-keeping had provided the foundation for Vivienne's conviction. Every incident I'd noted, every conversation I'd recorded, every pattern I'd identified had been validated by expert testimony and legal analysis. But perhaps the most healing part of the entire process had been the response from our community. The trial had prompted a broader conversation about psychological manipulation and domestic abuse, with many people coming forward to share their own experiences of being isolated from family members by controlling partners. Timothy and I had been approached by a local domestic violence organization to speak about our experience, helping other families recognize the warning signs of systematic manipulation. "The thing people don't understand about psychological abuse," Timothy had said during our first speaking engagement, "is how gradually it happens. Vivienne didn't wake up one day and decide to isolate me from my mother. She spent 3 years slowly, carefully, methodically convincing me that my natural love for my family was actually unhealthy attachment that was preventing me from being a good husband. Sarah had been an unexpected gift in our healing process. Unlike Vivienne, who had seen my relationship with Timothy as competition to be eliminated, Sarah actively encouraged their bond. She'd been the one to suggest the regular Sunday dinners that had now become a cherished tradition. She'd helped Timothy reconnect with his extended family and had even reached out to friends he'd lost touch with during the Vivienne years. A healthy relationship shouldn't require you to choose between your partner and your family, Sarah had told me during one of our early conversations. It should enhance all your relationships, not destroy them. Emma's delighted squeal brought me back to the present moment. She had successfully cracked an egg into the bowl without getting any shell pieces in the mixture, an accomplishment that clearly warranted celebration. "Look, Daddy," she called toward the porch, "I did it all by myself." Timothy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face bright with genuine happiness. "That's amazing, Em. You're becoming quite the baker." He wrapped his arms around both of us, creating a warm circle around the mixing bowl. "Just like your Grandma Eleanor." Sarah joined us in the kitchen, carrying a fresh bouquet of flowers from my garden. "These are for the dinner table," she said, beginning to arrange them in a vase. "Timothy told me how much you love having fresh flowers for Sunday dinner." As I watched Sarah work with the flowers, noting how naturally she fit into our family rhythm, I marveled at the difference between her presence and Vivienne's. Where Vivienne had always felt like she was performing a role, calculating every gesture for maximum impact, Sarah simply existed comfortably in our space. She asked questions about family traditions because she genuinely wanted to understand them, not because she was looking for ways to undermine them. The timer chimed, indicating that our first batch of cookies was ready. As I pulled the golden brown treats from the oven, filling my kitchen with the warm scent of vanilla and chocolate, I reflected on how this simple moment represented everything Vivienne had tried to destroy and everything we had fought to preserve. "You know what the best part is?" Timothy said, watching Emma carefully transfer cookies to the cooling rack with a spatula almost as big as she was. "Vivienne spent 3 years trying to convince me that spending time with you was a burden, that family obligations were keeping me from real happiness. But look at this." He gestured around my kitchen, where flour dusted every surface and Emma's laughter provided a soundtrack to our organized chaos. "This is real happiness. This is what she was so afraid I'd choose over her." Later that evening, after Sarah and Emma had gone home and Timothy was preparing to leave, he lingered in my foyer the way he used to as a child when he didn't quite want the day to end. "Mom," he said, his voice serious but peaceful, "I need you to know something. The poisoned cake wasn't the worst thing Vivienne did to our family." I waited, knowing he needed to finish the thought. "The worst thing was making me doubt my own love for you, making me question whether our relationship was healthy, whether my feelings were appropriate, whether caring about my mother made me a weak husband." He paused, looking around the foyer where family photos lined the walls. Pictures of him as a baby, his father and me on our wedding day, 3 generations of family gatherings and celebrations. She almost convinced me to throw away the most important relationship in my life because she couldn't stand sharing my heart with anyone else. "But you didn't throw it away," I reminded him. "Even when it was difficult, even when you were confused about what was real, you never stopped loving me. That's what saved us both." Timothy hugged me tightly, the way he used to when he was small, and wanted to make sure I'd still be there when he woke up. "I'm never going to let anyone come between us again. Not like that, not ever." As I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing around the corner where he used to ride his bicycle in endless circles, I thought about the nature of resilience. Vivienne had believed that 3 years of systematic manipulation would be enough to permanently destroy the bond between a mother and son. She had underestimated the power of genuine love to survive even the most sophisticated psychological warfare. Back in my kitchen, I packaged the remaining cookies in tins to send home with family members throughout the week. Each batch represented connection, tradition, and the simple joy of nourishing people you love. As I worked, I realized that Vivienne's greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating my survival instincts or Timothy's intelligence. Her greatest mistake had been believing that love could be destroyed by lies, when in truth, authentic love becomes stronger when tested by deception. She had spent 3 years trying to poison our relationship with manipulation and control, never understanding that real love is antidote enough for any toxin. The house grew quiet as I finished my evening tasks, but it was the peaceful quiet of safety and completion rather than the hollow silence of isolation. Duchess settled into her bed beside my kitchen table, and I turned off the lights, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of rebuilding, healing, and celebrating the family bonds that had proven themselves unbreakable. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, it's discovering that what they tried to destroy was actually indestructible all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.